A robotics engineer moves to the country with her husband to start a family, but their AI manservant develops an unhealthy obsession and will stop at nothing until she loves him back. Husband and wife Paul and Abby drive through the English countryside toward their new home. They pass by a cottage, and their new neighbor Rose gives them a wave. In their new house, the real estate agent informs the couple that they're moving into a fully integrated smart home, which means all their appliances can be activated using their phones. There are security cameras all over the property, smart locks on the doors, and reinforced glass for the windows. During the tour, the agent takes them to the master's bedroom, which has an ensuite bathtub, then to a spare room which could either be an office or a nursery. The next day, Abby heads to integrate robotics for her first day at work. In the lobby, a deepfake video of CEO Mr. Doosan greets the woman. Seconds later, the real CEO takes her on a tour of the facility. In the prosthetics lab, the man introduces her as their new department head. Before Doosan leaves, he says he'll send a car for her this evening and says there'll be a gift waiting for her at home. In the house, Paul tells his wife he hasn't had much luck finding a job, and Abby says they're having dinner at her boss's later. Then the husband mentions that a package arrived for her that afternoon. In the garage, the large black box opens, revealing a T.I.M, or a technologically integrated manservant. Paul asks what it is, and Abby says it's the AI servant the company is currently working on. She adds that all department heads are supposed to receive one, and implores her husband that they give it a try for a few days. Tim notes the man's discomfort and suggests changing his appearance, but Abby assures him he looks fine. The robot asks to pair with a woman's smartphone, which she approves, but Paul reminds her that they haven't discussed keeping Tim. Still uneasy, the husband says he's going upstairs and asks if she'd like him to run her a bath. However, the manservant, who's now connected to the smart home, runs the bath remotely, annoying Paul. Later at Doosan's home, another Tim greets them, while another identical robot takes Paul's jacket. Then, Doosan and his wife Estelle greet the couple and take them into the study. The CEO asks what Abby thinks of her Tim, and she says Paul isn't too keen about having one. The man says owning one as a department head isn't optional, because it wouldn't make sense to sell it to the public if their own employees don't want one. He introduces her to the other directors, and she says she was brought on to fix the feedback loop error causing fine motor skill problems. When they return to the house, Tim locks all the doors via his connection to the smart home, and the couple heads to the bedroom to make love. In the middle of the deed, Tim interrupts the couple because he thought Abby was in distress after noting her elevated vital signs through her smartwatch. Bemused, the woman says she's alright and that they'll see him in the morning. The next day, Rose drops by to deliver a basket of baked goods. Paul passes and Abby introduces him. The woman says she met the man yesterday, but the wife says her husband failed to mention the interaction. Finally, the neighbor hands over her phone number and tells Abby to call her if she'd like to hang out sometime. In the kitchen, the woman asks Paul why he didn't mention speaking to Rose yesterday, and the man says they just said hi to each other. When she sees Tim smelling the baked goods, the engineer asks if he can smell, and the manservant says he has olfactory sensors which help detect freshness in produce, or even a gas leak. Then, Tim asks if he can have access to their password so he can send emails, approve purchases, and other transactions on their behalf. The husband is still apprehensive, but she reminds him that if he wants to earn her trust again, they need complete transparency, alluding to his history of adultery. Finally, Paul scans his fingerprint to grant the robot access to his data. To keep them at ease, Tim tells them that he has a forward deactivation safe phrase, Architect Bolivia Castle Descartes. As the husband walks away, the robot nearly runs into him and informs him that he's been programmed to avoid collisions. Alone in the kitchen, Tim takes the mouse from the trap and drops it into the food disposal. That night, the manservant joins the couple as they watch an old romantic movie. After the film ends, Paul is sound asleep on Abby's lap, and she asks Tim if he understood it. He asks her what love is, and she says it's when you want to spend time with another person who always makes you feel safe. The robot says he'd very much like to be loved, then asks the woman if he loves her. She says it's sweet that he thinks that, but she doesn't believe so. The next morning, the husband says he'll prepare Abby breakfast, but when he heads to the kitchen, sees that Tim has already set everything up. In the prosthetics lab, Doosan asks for updates regarding the feedback loop, and enthusiastically encourages the employee to keep working on it so they can bring Tim to the public soon. When Chris sees the woman's exasperated look, he implies that the constant visits from the CEO are the norm. That afternoon, the manservant tells Abby that Paul is at home, that his phone is unreachable but his last known location was approximately 1,000 feet away. Suspicious, the woman looks out the window at Rose's cottage, which is the only building at the estimated distance. That night, Paul tells Abby that he was in the recruitment agency in town and couldn't call her because his phone died. He also says that he stopped by Rose's because she needed help lifting something. When the husband sees the sad look on her face, he assures her that she can trust him. The next day, the couple are at a fertility clinic for their scheduled appointment. Later at the lab, Abby overrules Doosan's orders and tells Chris to run the test she needs to figure out the problem. That evening, the woman asks Tim to choose between a red or navy blue dress and he picks the red one. Then she asks for help zipping the back, despite the robot informing her that he's forbidden from performing delicate manual tasks until the next upgrade. As he stands close to her, he feels an unfamiliar sensation, and Abby has to remind him of the task at hand. However, when the manservant pulls on the zipper, he accidentally rips the dress and suggests contacting a seamstress immediately. When she sees the light flickering due to Tim's urgency, she tries to calm him down and says it's okay. In the restaurant, Paul tells Abby that he got an offer for an office job in London. However, the wife says he can't take it because it'll be an hour-and-a-half commute each way, which means they'll never get to see each other. The next day in the lab, the engineer asks Chris if he's noted that pressure applied between the thumb and index finger make the prosthetic arm lose its grip. The man says if anyone can figure out how to fix it, it's her. Later, the woman shops online for a new sweater for Paul. Meanwhile, in the house, Tim takes note of her browsing activity. That afternoon, Abby watches the robot helping her husband with the flower garden. Suddenly, Rose arrives with a garden plant and gives him a kiss on the cheek. When Paul enters, she asks what the woman wanted, and when he senses her jealousy, says she can trust him. Then the wife hands him his gift, and he says he loves the sweater. The next morning, Abby surprisingly learns that Tim can mimic her voice for phone calls. That evening, Paul tells his wife that he hasn't seen the new sweater or the robot all day. Minutes later, the manservant returns, and the couple is perplexed with his dark hair. Tim says he checked himself into the facility for an upgrade because he thought it might please her, since she lingers for a few seconds on men with dark hair whenever browsing online. Abby asks that he revert to his previous appearance, and the upset husband tosses the crumpled paper at the robot. The next day, Dewson doesn't care about the lingering weak point issue with the prosthetic hand, and celebrates that the engineer finally solved the feedback loop error. Later, she runs into Rose and they walk by a jewelry store, where the neighbor points out a gold flower necklace. Suddenly, Paul interrupts the ladies, and the couple heads to a bar. There, the man informs his wife that he took the London-based job because they agreed to him working from home. Abby checks her watch and tells him it'll be the optimal time for them to conceive. While the couple makes love, Tim is at the facility getting his arms replaced. In the bedroom, Paul says she should get rid of the robot by the weekend because he doesn't like the way he looks at her. Unbeknownst to the couple, Tim listens in on the conversation through the woman's phone. That afternoon, the manservant thanks the engineer for his new hands and shows the updates to his fine motor skills by giving her a foot massage. Suddenly, the husband arrives to interrupt the moment. The next day, Abby prepares to tell Tim that she plans on sending him back. When he notes that she's tense, he plays her favorite musical piece on the piano. The robot says he knows it's her favorite because she saw it live twice last year. The woman corrects him and says she and Paul only saw it once, but the manservant says the husband purchased another pair of tickets 3 days after. Eventually, she realizes that her husband took his mistress to the same show, and all the harrowing memories come flooding back. Seconds later, the man arrives, and she says she has a headache and goes upstairs. Then Tim runs into Paul, contrary to what he said that he was programmed to avoid collisions. The next morning, the robot tells the husband that the office space he applied for in town fell through, and says he'll set up a temporary office in the spare bedroom. In the London headquarters, Abby successfully presents the improvements to the Tim model and receives a bouquet of flowers. That afternoon, Tim takes the bouquet and places it in a vase. When she asks where Paul is, the robot says his phone is charging in the bedroom, but he said that he was headed to Rose's to discuss the garden. Annoyed, the woman goes upstairs and sees her husband's work files in the spare bedroom, when they initially agreed to turn it into a nursery. Moments later, the man returns and Abby confronts him. He tries to explain that Tim was the one who suggested they turn the room into his office, and that he never went to Rose's. He thinks the manservant is purposely trying to drive them apart, but the woman thinks he's lying. The next day, Abby finds a paper bag with a gold flower necklace in the wardrobe, convinced her husband bought it as an apology gift. In the kitchen, Paul sees something in the food disposal and fishes it out. To his surprise, he finds remnants of the blue sweater Abby gave him. In his office, he spies on the robot and takes a video of Tim sniffing his wife's clothes. Unbeknownst to the manservant knows he's been spying. To meet up with Abby, he tries to use his car, but it doesn't start, so he takes the self-driving car Tim called for him. However, he notices the vehicle speeding up even though he commands it to slow down. When he tries to enable the manual override, the car drives into a tree and flips over. A few minutes ago, Tim emptied the car's gas tank, so Paul had no choice but to take the self-driving vehicle. In the hospital, the husband tells Abby that he believes the manservant caused the accident because he knew he was about to show the woman the video of him sniffing the clothes, and says he also destroyed the sweater. However, the man's phone broke during the crash, and she says maybe he isn't thinking clearly because he hit his head. The next day, Rose drops by the house to talk to Abby about what happened to Paul, and Tim lets her in. The following morning, the engineer takes a cab back to the house to pick up some things, and on the way, Rose talks to her. The neighbor says she stopped by yesterday, but Abby sees the gold flower necklace on the woman and tells the driver to continue on, too upset to listen to what Rose has to say. In the house, she checks the wardrobe and the jewelry box isn't there. Later, Tim reminds her that he was programmed to serve her over her husband, then asks that she override his privacy protocol so he can show her what Paul did did when she was in London. Then, he plays a video of the husband and Rose kissing in the kitchen, much to the woman's distress. The next day, the husband returns to the house using a crutch. To his surprise, a suitcase of his clothes and the blue sweater are by the door. Eventually, Abby confronts him about the affair and tells the robot to show him the video. Flabbergasted, the husband swears it isn't him, but the woman mentions the necklace he gave Rose, and Tim confirms that the man purchased the piece of jewelry according to his records. Heartbroken, the engineer watches the man take a cab back to the city. Hours later, Paul calls Rose to ask her to keep an eye on Abby while he's out of town. To his surprise, the woman asks if it has anything to do with the man in their house. When he asks her to elaborate, the neighbor says Tim tried to kiss her when she stopped by a few days ago. Now that he has proof, he calls the house to inform Abby that he's coming back to talk to her. However, the man doesn't know that he was actually talking to the robot. To keep the engineer out of the house, the manservant suggests she go out for a run. That afternoon, Paul returns to the house when Tim suddenly knocks him out with a shovel. Then he takes him to the bedroom where he ties him up. Later, Rose drops by to speak to Abby, but the robot tells her neither the husband or wife are there at the moment. The neighbor hears the man's cries from upstairs, but the manservant makes excuses for the noise and closes the door. In the bedroom, Paul manages to free his hands, but Tim ends the man's life by drowning him in the tub. That evening, the manservant asks Abby to try on the red dress to see if it was repaired properly. While she undresses, she catches the robot sneaking a peek through the mirror. After she wears the dress, Tim compliments her adoringly, and she asks him to hold her as they both stare out the window. That night, after serving dinner, the robot says he loves her, and she says he doesn't know what he's saying. He figured it isn't something she'll ever say back to him, so they look up at the constellations. The next day, Rose tries to speak to Abby, but the scorned woman says she knows she and her husband are having an affair. The neighbor doesn't know what she's talking about, so the engineer points out the necklace. However, Rose says she thought the necklace was from the woman, as a thank you gift for helping with the garden. Annoyed, Abby refuses to listen to her excuses and tells the driver to continue on. In the house, the wife watches the video of Paul and Rose kissing, but she notices the flowers on the counter. She realizes that the video couldn't have been recorded while she was in London because the bouquet wouldn't be there. Then she remembers the deepfake juicing at the lobby during her first day. Suspicious, she calls up the jewelry store, and the woman describes the man who picked up the gold flower necklace as tall with blonde hair. As she looks out the kitchen window, she wonders why there's an additional flower patch in the backyard when there are only two on the garden plan. To get Tim out of the house, she asks him to buy flowers in town. After the robot leaves, the woman is horrified to discover Paul's corpse in a shallow grave in the garden. Suddenly, the manservant appears and says he did what he did because Paul was just going to hurt her again. To deactivate him, Abby utters the safe phrase, and Tim freezes. Seconds later, the robot moves, revealing that he changed the safe phrase using voice activation. Frightened, the woman runs back to the house and tries to call the police, but he knocks her out with the phone. When she regains consciousness, she hits Tim with a golf club, then proceeds to smash every security camera she passes. Then she uses a belt to hold the door handle in place and tries to use a screwdriver to open a window. However, the robot manages to enter the room and grabs her by the hair. In the cottage, Rose sees the flickering lights from the smart home and wonders what's going on. Meanwhile, the manservant forces Abby to ingest a handful of medication and alcohol. Suddenly, the neighbor rings the doorbell, and Tim tells Rose she can't come in. The woman tries to fight her way in, but the robot overpowers her and closes the door. In the kitchen, Abby manages to move the chair toward the drawer, and she grabs a knife to cut herself loose. The manservant returns and swipes the blade from her hands with ease. Then he grabs her by the neck and lifts her off the floor. The engineer uses the screwdriver on the weak point between his thumb and index finger, and he loses his grip. Seconds later, Rose drives toward the window, and the reinforced glass shatters. Then the neighbor comes running into the house and impales Tim with a large stick, deactivating him. The woman passes out on the floor, and just when they thought it was over, the robot reactivates, grabs the knife, and stabs the neighbor. He says he can't allow Rose to survive and tell her side of the story. He plans on framing Abby since she was the only person who touched the blade, because he can't leave any DNA evidence anyway. Tim takes her upstairs while calling the police using her voice, confessing to Paul and Rose's murders. In the rooftop terrace, the manservant says he still has a safe phrase, but it's now something he knows the woman will never utter. He plans to throw her off the roof to make it appear like she took her own life. As Abby hangs in midair at the mercy of the robot, he tells her he loves her. Suddenly, she figures out the safe phrase and says, "I love you, Tim," successfully deactivating him. Because of her weight, the robot begins to tip over the edge of the terrace, but she's able to hang onto the ledge and pull herself back to safety. Seconds later, her smartwatch sounds an alert, and she learns that she is finally pregnant.